Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Governing for Disruption session. Please welcome again Greg Lindsay.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the third CNN Republican debate. Unfortunately, Carly Fiorina is polling at less than 1%, so we banished her to the kiddie table. But I am very proud to have multiple senators here to discuss how we are going to defund federal transportation. So thank you for joining us all. On a slightly more serious note, thank you. Welcome to the Whipping Boy session. We've heard so far through this conference, Nick Negroponte refer to those who spend a life in a lifetime of career service in civics as idiots. Of course, he was referring to the fact that we need to have a renewed civic service. But in a more serious vein, we've also heard all through this conference, the last 24 hours, we've heard not in angry tones, but I think somewhat in almost pitying tones about how government has sort of let down various forms of innovation or held it back or how it could be more innovative. Yesterday, we heard Jeanette Sadiq-Khan basically rail against the sort of the failing role of the feds in funding transportation in cities and how it's essentially fallen to the cities and other governments to sort of pick up the slack in this. So I'm hoping we can spend this session really discussing, picking up the thread where Tim and his panelists left off from there, about really sort of what positive role the government can play in sort of creating the shared mobility revolution, and also I think even a broader sense of what we were talking about yesterday about carbon emissions and equity and access, things that Matt George was also talking about too. So with a panel this size, we'll see how much we can get into this. I'm going to begin by sort of asking sort of each of our participants to talk about their roles and interests here. We're fortunate enough to have basically representatives from the federal level, the city level, folks from MIT, John Clippinger is here, and we've got Peter Marx in from Los Angeles for a West Coast perspective, so we're not just East Coast myopia. And so hopefully start to delve into some of these issues about really, how can government start to accelerate to the speed of change here? And I think Nigel and Chris might be able to talk to that a bit from their experience in the Office of New Urban Mechanics. So with that, I'm going to start with our federal reps. Vince and then Bob Sheehan are going to talk about, I guess, sort of their roles and their interests and sort of what they're sort of doing. So with that, Vince.
Well, good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Vince Valdes, and I'm the Associate Administrator for Research and Innovation at the Federal Transit Administration. I came all the way up from Washington, D.C. to hear us called everything from, let's see, brain dead, absentee, Soviet, idiots, and my personal favorite, knuckleheads, over the last couple of days. And, I feel that. I get it. My background is that I'm an engineer, but I'm also an urban planner. I took my degree in urban planning at Columbia University and worked for DC for about 3 or 4 years. So I get the local zeitgeist. I understand what that is. I also, though, want to take a little issue with perhaps Janet Sadiq-Khan's, exhortation that we're missing the ball or that we've somehow dropped the ball. Really, if you think about kind of where the national highway system came from, it came from a situation where it was from the 1950s, it was about interstate commerce and it was about actually national defense. And those were national level arguments. Those were national level issues that needed to be addressed at the national level. My job at the Federal Transit Administration, and I get to look down the stream 5, 6, 10 years, my job, I feel, is to take this, what we're hearing here, and I think it was wonderful to hear Matt George speak out at the last session. I mean, he almost made my presentation for me. It's about raising this to the national level so that we're not preaching to the choir. We're urbanists, we get it, urbaner than thou. All of that's good stuff, but we need to take this conversation from the San Franciscos and the New Yorks and the Boston and spread it out over the country. And I'm here to do that. I'm here to hear this conversation. I'm here to talk about what we want to do. And at the federal level, at the F.T.A., we have a $10 billion program. The vast majority of that goes out to subsidize transit. In that program, my research program is about $15 million. So you now start to see the scale. I feel that my program is safe space so that we can start showing and demonstrating these wonderful practices that we've heard about over the last couple of days. And that's what I want to do. Over the next year, what I'd like to do is put together a kind of, I guess I'm calling it a mobility on demand or shared use sandbox, and I want to put money out on the street so that we can see different operational models in different parts of the country. Because I think it was Emily who said, Castor, who said, it's not going to be the same for every municipality. It's not going to be the same in every region. We need to see different practices and different models in different parts of the country. And therefore, you start to socialize this whole concept. You start to get buy-in at the political level. I think it was Jerry who said that this is a cultural issue. This is a cultural issue. It's as cultural as the national highway system was when we were talking about national defense and interstate commerce. And if we can raise it to that level, then we can make policy decisions and therefore regulations that make sense and that are responsive to what the American people want. That's my point.
Thank you, Vince. Bob, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Bob Sheehan. I'm with the U.S.DOT's Intelligent Transportation System Joint Program Office. This office came out of the highway side, but I lead the multimodal ITS, and I co-lead our Mobility on Demand program. And the intent is to walk lockstep with F.T.A. So Vince can touch on the transit side, although referencing the history of the highways, which is right, but it goes back to early 20th century about the shift from transit to SOV approach for our system design. But my intent is to walk lockstep. And I can also talk about the highway side, and it's something I want to talk about to reflect and this came up many times over the past day and a half, about the use of our right-of-way. The correct use of our right-of-way, and the value of the public space. I mentioned parking, but the value of the roadway. And I find it challenging. I give an example of folks and try to hopefully make it clear and always look for a better way to say it. But we design railways and busways and separate guideways for our transit service. But we already have that. We have a whole contiguous network of roadway, and why aren't we using it better? We can use for not just the transit service for a bus, and we defined in the previous session what is the limitations and what the definition of a bus. But we have other services. I'm going to call out microtransit because I like that term. And Matt, it was exciting in Virginia. I was going down up Route 28, which is about 20 miles outside of D.C., and I almost got in an accident because my head turned and I saw the bridge vehicle. And I was like, that's outstanding. So white and big red letters. And I thought that was outstanding because I saw that shift. But I also want to see a shift of how the highway agencies start incorporating these services into their designs. I'll give an example, and hopefully it makes sense. We're kind of defining as dynamic identified bus. And I realize I have to identify something different. Dynamic identified something, a vehicle providing the same service that a transit agency would provide. So I'll call out bridge as an example. Right now, transit agencies, transit buses, and local and regional, they get signal priority, because you mentioned priority in the previous session, and we mentioned it multiple times. They are granted signal priority at an intersection with technology because they're serving that public good, and they are a public agency-provided service. But if bridge shows up and it's providing a similar service, should they be granted that same technology and that same priority that anyone else would be? Because now we're looking at a shared use environment. They're all providing that similar service. So I'm focused on that. I'm focused fundamentally on an integrated approach. We've talked about several different ideas, innovative approaches, and I think it's exciting. And my head is actually spinning in excitement. But I need to see, and I want to promote the ecosystem, bringing those together. And that's really the core of my effort within my program. Because to me, I mean, it is the fundamental approach. So lastly, there are a lot of ideas. And so I really come to you with the questions. We've identified the needs. We've talked about ideas. But now I need to know how to do it. I need to know how to convert the logical, data-driven arguments into the story, and in some cases into an illogical discussion, so I can make the argument to those that I need to communicate to. Now, lastly, I'll touch on what Vince said, and I think the last thing I'll add to that list was bless their little hearts for the government employees. And the thing is, maybe comments hurt, but maybe truth hurts. But to me, it's not a complete story because we are committed to this. And I hope that where I am, I'm allowed to and enabled to empowered to improve the quality of life. So I need a question to you. Maybe it's a utopian kind of question, but I need your help to, as we change this world, to ultimately change, or I need your help to change my world, so that we can ultimately change the world in general. So I truly thank, I'm thankful for the opportunity to be here, and I'm going to reference the ball comment. I see it as a ball of yarn with so many pieces of string, and I need to find out which string do I pull first. How do I untie this knot to be able to enable that change?
Thank you, Bob. Ask not what the feds can do for you, but ask what you can do for the feds.
I like that better. That would have.
That goes with Nick's call for 1960s JFK WASP civil service again. Peter, the LA perspective, please give us what's happening on the West Coast for your mind in this, about really the role of governance in this.
You know, as the only person from the West Coast, let me put it this way. Despite having been married for 15 years, my New York father-in-law still introduces me as, this is Peter, he's from California. Let that rattle around your brains for a minute. So I'm the Chief Technology Officer for the city of Los Angeles. It's a big city over on the West Coast. And by the way, this is a safer environment than speaking in San Francisco. And in the city of Los Angeles, as a senior technology guy, I touch a lot of things. I touch public safety, I touch transportation, I touch sustainability, I touch, you know, a lot of different systems. Because in the city, we have the second largest airport. We'll have more than 70 to 75 million people come through the airport this year. And they're going to enter, you know, the second largest city. Alongside that, we also own and operate the port. 40% of the U.S. economy comes through the port of Los Angeles and Long Beach. We own and operate the streets. We participate on the board and do a lot of work with the Metropolitan Transit Agency, which is a very large bus and rail system. We have 5 rail lines under construction. We're doing bike share, as we all know. We're doing tons of stuff everywhere across the space. And then, in addition, we also have a very thriving private ecosystem with whom we do a lot of interactions with. And we'll get into that a little bit later in this conversation. But suffice it to say that Los Angeles, you know, we've taken this point of view that we're one of the largest, if not the largest, automotive markets. Some people have commented that there's sometimes traffic in Los Angeles, and that is a pressing issue for us all. And alongside that includes things like parking and everything else. And I'm just going to make one little mention, which is that Salita Reynolds, who's the general manager of LADOT, was wise enough to recognize how much transportation is being disrupted by technology. So earlier this year, we put out a fellowship with the Goldhirsch Foundation. We hired Ashley Hand to come in and work with the entire ecosystem across the space, and she's here today, to literally start looking at how do we actually adjust our policies and our procedures, our processes, our organizations to address technology disruption with the eye of not only making transportation more efficient and a better user experience, but also more sustainable, more equitable, et cetera.
Great, thank you, Peter. Paul, please.
I'm Paul Mackie, Communications Director at Mobility Lab, and we were a little hesitant perhaps to even be on this panel because our secret's out now. A lot of people don't even, of course, know who Mobility Lab is because we're pretty young, we're 3 or 4 years old, but we are part of Arlington County government. And Arlington County is an interesting case in transportation in that it was just a thoroughfare into DC 30, 40 years ago, really ugly place, and now it's a beautiful place known for its transportation-oriented development, its transportation demand management. And so about 20 years ago, the county started keeping really good records and data on ridership and how people and employees and commuters were using the system. And so the research turned over and was kept all that time. And about 4 or 5 years ago, Mobility Lab was envisioned, and I came in to help tell the stories of the original research that the Mobility Lab is doing. And you know, we're disrupting transportation, and Mobility Lab is disrupting government from within. So we're really excited. We do all kinds of things. Like my main role is to make sure that we are a media organization, essentially. And we've hired more than 100, or we have more than 100 contributors. Anybody who's here who wants to talk about transportation options and getting people to know about and understand and use their transportation options, it's actually a little more brain surgery than you would think, because we're programmed to go and slump into our cars and get to work and sit there and go back the other same way in our cars. So we're really trying to educate people about they have transportation options, and they can start to use them. So the sharing economy element is really exciting in this whole thing. But other ways we're disrupting is we have a transportation camp that we're the lead on, started in DC about 5 years ago, and now it's in other cities around the country. That is showing developers that actual citizens are out there getting together at transportation camp and coming up with ideas and plans and using data and hopefully beginning to tell better stories about how we use our transportation system. So that's really disrupting and hopefully disrupting the city planner realm. We started less than 2 years ago a transportation techies group, and somehow it's up to from 0 to 1,300 people just in the DC area who are transit geeks, who are techies, who are hackers, and we have a monthly hack night. And it was just featured in the Washington Post in a big story just a couple weeks ago. And so that's a really exciting space that is starting to influence. And I'll stop at that. We're doing lots of other things, and we want to actually. One other thing is that in Arlington we have we're planning to do sort of a shared mobility, an on-demand mobility, a full mobility package of all the suites that Tim Pompadour talks about. You know, being able to pay for it, book it, get real-time information, ride, transfer, all that. We really want to look at ways that we can make that happen in Arlington and DC. So that's another thing that's on our radar.
Great, thank you, Paul. Nigel and Chris, I'm going to take you as a unit. I don't know how you want to divide it up here, but you know, you're both in the office of neuromechanics, so please.
So it turns out we are no longer both in the office of neuromechanics, but we can get into that. My name is Nigel Jacob, and I run an organization in the city of Boston called the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. Neuromechanics is, in a sense, sort of a meta organization in relation to what we're talking about here. So we're not exclusively a transportation-focused group. Our job is really to invent the future of city services. And we do that by collaborating with different units of government across the entire kind of frame of city government. We work with our IT department, we work with the school department, with our housing department, transportation, and so on. And the particular approach that we've been developing, I think, is that we've been kind of evolving over the past several years. I think it responds directly to this question of like, how can government rise to the challenge of thinking in this different way? And it is really, how do we create the capacity in government to experiment and to be people-centered in its approach to developing new kinds of services. So I think one of the biggest failings that we often find when we talk about government's role in doing anything is that we start automatically talking about very long-term planning and big dollars associated with that. And at some level, we have to do those things, certainly. But there's, I think, a lot of room prior to those things to be running actual experiments to see what should be in that plan, and not sort of talk in a theoretical way as to what the future of the city should be. So our job in neuromechanics is to work across all these different departments to find ways to enable them to do that kind of experimentation. I'll let Chris introduce himself, but a lot of the work that we're doing with Chris and his departments is really. So let me spill it. So Chris is the chief of streets for the city of Boston.
Nigel will be talking for me during this.
Yeah. And so what that means is he has he controls a lot of the street infrastructure. But for us, what that means, so neuromechanics, we do a lot of work with him and his team. And for us, what that boils down to is, how do we, when you look at the street infrastructure that we have, how do we create the capacity to experiment with what should actually be happening there, both in a technological sense, but also in a policy sense? We want the ability to periodically tweak the regulations on sections of street, or at least I do, so that we can try a few of these different experiments. Because whenever a lot of the creative stuff that's happening in places like MIT or in different startups, that eventually washes up on our shore. And we are often, the question for us is, do we just buy into one of these things or do we not? And so rather than saying yes or no to those things, we say, let's turn this into an actual experiment or a prototype that we can use to prove whether or not what you're claiming actually works. So it's a different way of thinking about the way government can respond in a regulatory capacity and in a technological capacity as well to the innovations that we're seeing in mobility and housing and education and so on.
So I'm Chris Osgood. Until quite recently, I was Nigel's partner in crime at the Mayor's Office of Neuromechanics. I've been replaced by another Chris, the 2.0 version of me who's in the back of the room, Chris Carter. And I have become, as Nigel said, the city's chief of the streets. And Nigel talked about sort of the disruption side of governing for disruption, and I wanted to talk for a moment about the governing side. I think there's a role of governing that is really important here, that in some ways we need to be providing sort of direction for the disruption that we want to see to make sure that that disruption actually meets the public good. And in the city of Boston, as we think about disruption for the intent of mobility, we're really doing that through an effort led by somebody else in the back of the room named Alice Brown. Alice is leading an effort called Go Boston 2030. This is a significant community process to really define what mobility means for the people of Boston and the things that we should really be aspiring to as we work with both new providers and old providers of transportation services or existing providers of transportation services. And really 3 things rise to the top as we've gone through this planning exercise. One is to expand economic opportunity in the city. The second is to increase equity. And the third is to improve sustainability. In Boston, as you guys know, we have a mass transit system, which is a radial mass transit system, which serves our downtown and serves our downtown fairly well. We have some huge economic growth sectors in our city, though, like the Longwood Medical area and the South Boston waterfront, that we actually need to find new ways of getting employees to those areas from throughout the region. We have census tracts in our city with that have our lowest household income are often the furthest distance from mass transit. Or furthest distance from most reliable mass transit and spend the largest share of their wallet on transportation services. We need to figure out a way to provide transportation more accessibly and more affordably to those folks who can benefit from it most. And we are a city on the sea like Los Angeles. We are very focused on sea level rise and on storm surge. And while our greenhouse gas emissions from transportation are declining in our city, we need to do much more to accelerate it. And we're not going to be able to achieve those economic or sustainability or equity objectives without disruption and without governance and without those 2 things working together. And Nigel highlighted, I feel like, 2 of the 3 big ways that we're going at that in Boston. One is through experimentation, figuring out ways of working with all of you to see what might work in our city. The second is figuring out how we actually look at our regulations so that it can be relevant as modes change, and how we balance being nimble and being predictable, both of which have great value. And the third piece is really one which Kent Larson touched on at the beginning of this session yesterday, which is really around engagement. A lot of what we're doing around Go Boston 2030 and a lot of what Kent has been doing in partnership with a number of groups here in the city is figuring out how we better engage disruptors, the disrupted, and the general public, so that together we can set a vision so that we can use all of the energy and all of the opportunity that we've all been talking about for the last day towards the common good.
Great, thank you. And finally, playing the role of Donald Trump at the end.
Well, no, I'm not channel. I'm on the far left. I'm going to channel Bernie.
You're far right from my perspective.
Far right. And actually, not so bring. I want to channel Nicholas when it comes to the comments that he made. And I did talk to him after his talk, and he said that he was talking about the importance of sharing society, the civic society, and then he also said he's a socialist. And I wanted to correct him and say, it's more mutualism. It's more like Prince Kropotkin. And so I channeled Prince Kropotkin. But I have been a technology provocateur of some kind for a number of years. I was at the Berkman Center for 10 years, started something called the Law Lab. And it has been the sort of the Sisyphean task of how do you get people to have control over their personal data and their identities? That wasn't something that was seen as very important 10 years ago. Now it's more, now people are starting to appreciate it. And it's also to get a new mindset about how to think about data, because none of this stuff is going to work. This is all driven by creating a data-rich environment. Yeah. And it's totally data-driven, and our policies and how we think about data are derived from the 70s. And we think about data in the classical notion of we collect data about something, we look at it, we make observations, and we're very careful about not to the harms come in their inappropriate collection. But in fact, a lot of the harms come in not having the data flow. Data's like water, it has to flow. Yeah. You don't want to contaminate it, you don't want to dam it, you don't want to pollute it anything, but it has to flow. And we do not have a regulatory model on how to think about this. It's all locked into the 70s, and even the best intentions, and then you come out of the White House on the personal consumer data Bill of Rights. It's great aspirational documents, but it's sort of like the Soviet Constitution. It's more observed in the breach than in its essence. And so part of it is you're actually doing real experimentation in how to develop new models of governance, and because it doesn't scale. And so one of the things that we've been looking at is when you're moving to totally decentralized systems, and what does that mean institutionally? Because our institutions are not decentralized, they're hub and spoke, they're not peer-to-peer. And the only way we're going to be able to have an effective and accountable set of governance mechanisms is to devise new kinds of digital institutions that can do that. And so there's some really interesting experiments that can be done. And one of the things that we did, it was about 8 or 9 years ago at Harvard, we developed sort of self-executing contracts. Well, what does it mean to have autonomous contracts that you can audit and you know how it's going to perform? And then how do you and then we actually applied genetic algorithms to generate new contracts that met certain constraints. I mean, my background is in AI and linguistics, and I've done a number of startups. But I'm really interested in this whole governance issue because I think we have to think about the problem very differently, and it's institutional design issue that people are not confronting. And so we've gotten involved in how to develop a set of protocols. I mean, with just a little more background. So I came from Harvard over to MIT, and what got me interested in MIT, because I'd been here a number of years before, is that MIT is an engineering culture. We build stuff. And you really have to start building and deploying and testing at this point. So with Sandy Pentland, he was doing some really interesting work in being able to collect data off the mobile phone. And the machine learning, and it could start predicting what your next sentence would be. And when he spoke at the Berkman Center, he was Dr. Evil. I mean, he was just like, get that man out of here. But I thought, well, no, actually, this is something we have to solve. We have to figure a way of being able to collect the data off the phone, because that is the device. At the same time, give you control over it, and at the same time be able to share it and work out an institutional perspective around it. Seems like a pretty complex problem. It is. And so what we came up with was a set of principles, and we had a nonprofit set up. We started developing reference technology. So that what we call the Windhover principles basically say there's sort of a new framework, what I would call an open sector. It's not a private sector, it's not a public sector, it's an open sector around a set of protocols. And if people opt into those protocols, then you can collect data about yourself, you can control that data, you can make certain assertions that other trusted authorities can accept. But it's a highly decentralized system. And what raises some really interesting questions, I mean, I don't know if people are tracking the Bitcoin and blockchain discussion here, but that is a profound shift. It also has a very strong libertarian taint, that if you start to look at the protocol there, it's a recipe for cooking the planet. And so it's in that way, I think it's unnecessary and irresponsible, but nothing, I don't want to say more about that. So I slept on some toes. But I think a fundamental question is, and it comes to this notion of autonomy. We have autonomous vehicles. We're going to have decentralized autonomous organizations and authorities. We can design those. It's like regulation through API calls. You can't scale things unless you can do that kind of stuff. Well, okay, what kind of oversight do you have in that? How do you design them and test them? So actually, we're working with a state. We got the governor of a state who's very enlightened, who's very interested in implementing a lot of these ideas and running actual test beds at scale. And that's another challenge, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you, John. I think it's telling that we started off with Vince talking about safe spaces and Bob asking you for help, and ending with the notion of the NSA for transit and the notion of complete exit out of governance. It is easier to imagine the end of governance, transit governance, than it is to imagine functioning transit governance, apparently. There were a lot of perspectives on here, and I'm going to take the unconventional step, if we have microphones out there, of addressing my first question to someone who's not on the panel. If Peter, you mentioned Ashley was here, because I would love to hear from her, because I would actually love to hear, because one of the questions I'm going to ask you is really about, LA has taken the step of creating essentially an autonomous czar, of someone who to handle these issues. So do we have microphones floating around in here, please?
I'm sorry, Ashley.
Can we pass the microphone to Ashley? Ashley, I really want to hear about how you conceive your role and about really how much authority do you have, because this is one of the things I get to. To me, the interesting part is, we heard we need the call for pilots. Vince wants to run a sort of sandbox. We have a meta organization in the form of neuromechanics. LA created, a special role with a fellowship there. So I'm curious about whether you can cleave across this. Do you have special powers? But how do you perceive your role, and how do you intend to sort of execute this to really be this point person for LA?
Can I also just mention that Ashley was also the Chief Innovation Officer for Kansas City?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So I'm not new to this idea of what framework can we create within government to look at the opportunity to test and scale and look at new policies around not only eliminating the barriers to new innovation, but also kind of eliminating kind of this holding up of the status quo. So we've already done that, and I've done that before in Kansas City, which was a really great opportunity. And I think I am fortunate enough to have the support of leadership that is looking to really understand where the DOT of the future really should be. And I think we see that in Salita Reynolds. I think we see in the fact that we found a foundation outside of city government to support this. And the work that I've actually been able to kind of collaborate with in the mayor's office and things like that, we're already making that work. So the idea is really how can we create a platform that opens us up to new ideas that we can kind of test quickly and rapidly prototype. And I think there's a lot to be learned from peers in other cities. And I think that's something that I've been very lucky to have already tried for the last few years, and now I can bring it into Los Angeles. I think the challenge we have in Los Angeles is that the jurisdictional overlap is very, very complex. And so the kind of scope of what LA DOT actually owns and manages is very slim compared to kind of the scale of the problem. So I think one of the reasons why I was brought in to this fellowship is the fact that I'm able to kind of reach across to different groups and kind of identify where those opportunities are that we all kind of share and how can we work on that in a really quick way. And then I'm also supported by a national advisory board that brings in capacity and expertise that helps us kind of bring things into LA that's specific to LA, but not necessarily in a way that's so much concern on a political level that we can't show that it hasn't been tested and tried. And I think LA is a little behind in the sharing economy models. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to really leverage those best practices that have been learned by other cities. And that helps us to kind of build more momentum and more support. So on Monday night, when I was at a public meeting where I was told that all public sector employees are stupid, I basically sat there and said, well, you know, the fact is that you would never have seen this role a generation ago because that's not the way our siloed organizations really traditionally function. But the fact is that's not the way that we're solving problems anymore. The problems are more complex. It requires a multi-discipline approach. And so bringing in an architect to solve our transportation questions is part of that approach that we're taking. And I think more and more as we bring in that kind of collaborative decision making, we're really changing the norm. And I think that's something that I've been empowered. I work very closely with Peter, and Salita has been a huge champion for this. And I hope that the success of this strategy will help support the success of LADOT and the region as a whole.
Thank you so much.
And please, thank you, Peter, for putting me on the spot.
If you'd never mentioned she was here, I never would have called on her, Peter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, we have 22 minutes to solve the role of governance in here before the next session. So I'm going to ask one question and then turn it over to you to throw brickbats and tomatoes at the panel. And that is, and I think Ashley brought it up, and I've heard the whole theme in here. And that is the question of, just as an aside, the Transportation Roadshow goes to Pasadena next week. I'm at the California Transit Association with Tim and Salita, who's not here, and Susan Sheehan, and we're on the opening panel. And Salita said something on our prep call that was interesting, which is the notion of, do we need to rethink of ourselves as mobility managers in transportation as we manage mobility in the entire region in all forms? And I think of that in context of, based on what you're talking about, the notion of creating these hybrid organizations that span the silos, like New Urban Mechanics is, at every level, do we need to create essentially a new interface layer to work with these outside organizations? And then how do you structure that interface layer? Is it the form of Ashley? Is it the New Urban, the Office of New Urban Mechanics? What is that role at the federal level? Is that you, Vince? If it's impossible for the silos to actually deal with this on their own, is there a way to actually functionally create this? Do we have enough models in place? Or how would you go about structuring the ideal sort of interface layer to deal with the shared mobility startups? And also, just as a question on top of that is do we need to devolve governance further to the cities and even further there? You guys want to basically toy with changing regulations to do experiments. Tim was complaining last night at dinner the fact that he can't touch the streets in San Francisco because those are decided at the state and federal levels. So do we need to see a vast devolution here to allow innovation as quickly in the government sector and dealing with the actual streetscape that we do as we're seeing on the private sector side? Break off question that you like in there and please address it. Anyone? Peter.
I'll just say that it's really a lot faster and easier to deal with digital before dealing with the physical infrastructure. And what I mean by that is, for example, John brings up data. Well, we we publish a lot of data. We followed Boston's model to a great degree with our open data portal, and we publish data wherever we can. And we've increasingly been doing data sharing deals with the private sector. We did a deal with Google and other companies. Waze is probably the best example, where every 2 minutes they give us a snapshot of everything happening across the streets. No personally identifiable information, but we have 1.5 million people driving around sensing what's happening on the streets. And in return, we give them all the road closures and farmers markets and that LA thing of film shoots and all the rest of it. And that data is done as is, on a handshake, just go do what you need to do. We don't take money, it's non-exclusive. They don't take money, it's non-exclusive. And it's frankly for the better. And there's lots and lots of examples where transportation and data go hand in hand. And that's on the digital side to make the experience on the physical layer that much easier, if you will.
Anyone?
I guess for me, it goes back to the discussion of governance. What exactly are we governing for, right? Having worked at the local level and then at the federal level, I have this kind of interesting worldview. At the local level, and very often we had the argument, I was working for DC, it was like, well, we want maximum flexibility. And we were talking to the feds or what passes as a state kind of level governance or government. We want maximum flexibility to do X, Y, or Z, whatever it is. But we want you also to mitigate all the risk. And that becomes our dynamic tension. We're here to help mitigate that risk, but provide flexibility. That's not an easy endeavor. And how you do that, I don't know. Perhaps, maybe the model I'm taking of trying to at least facilitate at the local level, experimentation, okay, take a risk on this, and it's a safe space. But that wouldn't be the case in the rest of the program at F.T.A. That $10 billion is very protected because it's dear money. It's taxpayer money. I can take the $15 million that I've got, play a little bit. It's a risk-free zone, but I still have certain rules and regulations I've got to enforce. Equitability and accessibility and all of the things that really are basic values, in terms of governance. But how you do that on the program side, that's more than a 20-minute conversation, I can tell you.
Yeah. Anyway, Nigel, then Paul, and then John.
Okay.
So I'll say, we've talked over the last couple of days about the changing role of government, and and we have a fairly newish mayor in Boston, and as a result, we've been thinking a lot and talking a lot about the role of City Hall and his role and so on. And so one of the classic ways of describing what we do is certainly not the only way, but one way of thinking about it is that in terms of how people interact with government, that there is the transactional. Right? There's you pay things and you get something out. There's a consultative, right? So where we do community meetings to kind of understand what the community feels. But increasingly, there's a third dimension to that, and it's the collaborative. So over the last 2 years, prior to Chris's departure, and certainly my work with the new Chris, we are. And I know this is the same for Yasha and his team in the IT department. We are seeing a deluge of innovators stepping forward that want to work with government, right? So I think that we are no longer seeing, at least in the local government, right? So I have precious little experience with the federal government, but at least for us, that we are seeing people that are walking in off the street that are no longer just pointing fingers at us, right? They want to work with us, and it's not in a high-handed way, right? They're like, here's a thing, you should use this thing. No, not at all. It's very much one of, here's a thing, we think it might have value, but what do you think? And so I think that this is a completely different dynamic in terms of how government is rolling up its sleeves and working with startups, researchers, community groups, social entrepreneurs. And so I think that you're right. I think that we do need to find more effective ways of making us more porous around the edges so that we should be very findable, right? That's one of the reasons that we come to these kinds of sessions, right? It is to be available for people that want to engage with government and to figure out how do we solve these problems together. And so I think that I will say that we don't see that uniformly across the entire enterprise of government. And oftentimes it's sort of driven by some combination of personality and/or function. But I think that increasingly those parts of government that aren't actively trying to make themselves available and to work and to find the genuine ways to work with the innovators outside of government are finding themselves being left behind. And so I think that there is a need to figure out, structurally, how do you make that work and scale those things that work.
Yeah, Paul.
Yeah, that's great. And people all over the country don't know that governments are there advising corporations and businesses on how their employees can get federal transit benefits, or that they can have ways to build showers or locker rooms for people who could bike or walk to work. So I think that's really key. With Mobility Lab, think of communication is something that's left out really of transit agencies and is left out of government across the board in so many ways. Think of the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl has just endless commercials of cars driving along beautiful stretches of highways with beautiful, freedom within the car, and you're a patriot, and it is the American way. That is a lot for all of us at transit agencies to overcome. Public transportation is not on during the Super Bowl. There aren't people looking really happy, having a good time on public transportation. They're getting work done. They're being productive. They're probably enjoying it, but that's not necessarily how it's perceived. There's a real nice spot with the Ubers and the Lyfts of the world starting to televise, starting to advertise, and starting to open up the thought that, hey, we can share. This could be a sharing economy, and so that's going to make it really easier for people to think. When autonomous vehicles come in place, people are going to be able to think, well, I can use a shared one. That actually makes sense. I don't have to buy my own. So that's, I think, paving the way really nicely for that. But with Mobility Lab, Arlington County has agreed to have a media organization talking about transportation options. And that's one way that we get so many people, public and private, coming to us wanting to do collaboration, wanting to do things in this space. So I just think if everybody left here today and went back with their organizations and hired a journalist, maybe hired a strategic communicator, the bigger you are, maybe hire more of a team. It's a very simple message. There's so much nuance. There's so much nuance on this panel. There's been so much nuance in this entire conference that we've got to tell the simple message that people actually have transportation options. It's surprising they don't know that, but we need to do a better job of telling them that they have that and giving them avenues to find that.
John, then Peter, if you have a comment. John.
Oh, okay.
Do you have something?
I'm listening to this, and I'm feeling like, okay, I'm really several standard deviations off the norm here. It's a familiar position, but I think that when I think about governance, and I think about governments don't own governance, and I think that in the same thing that banks don't own banking. And where I have been very involved in is in the transformation of the banking industry. And earlier in my career, I was very much involved in newspapers, and I worked at a large consulting firm, and was trying to get newspapers to deal with the fact that what was happening, and this thing Craigslist came along, and how could that possibly affect their business, And now you look at some of the New York Times has got a market cap of $2.5 billion, and Vice has got a market cap of $3 billion. It's been marginalized, and you're moving to a whole new kind of infrastructure. You're going from a hub and spoke hierarchical structure to a totally distributed system, powers at the edge. It's data driven. It's a different business model. It's a different regulatory model. It's a different way of thinking. It's very, very hard for companies to adapt that. It's very hard for banks to do it. I mean, I can name all the top banks, and they'll make the nod towards it. Things like blockchain, they're trying to get their arms around it, the Bitcoin. They're trying to immunize themselves to it. But the current regulatory structures don't work in the financial industry. I think anyone will argue about that. You have the same set of issues. And so I think when you talk about governing for disruption, it's really how to invent new forms of governance and be open to that, because the current forms don't work. Your decision cycle is too short. I mean, just think about the whole legislative process and how fast things go in the technology, and how in the world you're going to keep up with the normal governance process. You're going to have to be fundamentally innovative in this. So I think it's more like 1848 than anyways.
Well, it's funny. Every time you mention blockchain, I keep thinking of Lazuz, which is the interesting Israeli peer-to-peer ride-sharing service that runs on blockchain right now, and they're basically being paid in their cryptocurrency. The more rides you give, the more rides you get, and it's monitoring that. And every time I read about it, I wonder how deeply illegal it would be in the United States, even though it's a very communal form, and personally, I think it's a very interesting idea. But Chris, I think you were going to say something.
I just want to build on.
And then Peter.
Oh, sorry, Peter.
Peter, you were signaling
okay.
first. Go ahead, Peter.
I'll defer to the hometown.
Thanks so much. So just thinking of the new models of governance and your question about devolution, one of the things that I feel like we've learned very well in the Mayor's Office of Neuromechanics is that to push innovation, it requires both that exploration and that integration within a civic context. It is not effective if you want to take innovation to scale, to do it totally outside of the system that is ultimately going to be managing that innovation. So thinking of your devolution point, as wonderful as it potentially would be for any city in here to have all authority sort of devolve to us, unless that is the ultimate sort of the governance structure that is going to exist, it doesn't make sense for that to be the sort of structure that exists for innovation. Instead, what we need is essentially some way in which the innovation office we have in a city, the innovation office you have at the federal government, the innovation offices that are being built at MassDOT, that we figure out a better way for all of us to experiment together in the same sandbox, because it's through that we'll be able to do something which actually can then scale out once it proves effective or we learn from when it doesn't.
Peter.
Let me be a little bit provocative, which is let's use a very, very specific example. We've done a lot of talking, people keep on referencing connected autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars, for the last 2 days. So let's talk about that for a second. We're in a building at MIT that's got a lot of robots, little robots in this building, and around here we have a lot of roboticists. And we're at a moment right now where things could happen in one of really two ways. We could go to a world which is sort of idealistic. We have a shared economy. We don't need to own the vehicles. When it's done taking me to where it needs to go, it trundles off and does something useful for somebody else. Life is good, right? Mobility is a service. The robots are there to drive you across town safely without running over pedestrians and bicyclists, and deliver you with a quality of service. It's a very different model. It feels a lot more digital and online, modern, yeah, all the rest of it. There's another vision, though, which is that cars start following Moore's law, and we get twice as much functionality every 2 years for half as much money. And they multiply like, well, they multiply like robots with robots. I don't know.
Great goo problem.
Right. And suddenly our streets are filled with big robots, little robots, things carrying the pizza for the person down the street. Everybody owns robots. Every delivery shop owns robots. Every pizza shop owns robots. My 11-year-old owns a robot. Not so thrilled about that. And suddenly our streets are actually even more crowded and congested, and our issues are even, frankly, magnified. Those are the two visions. One, good, 40% less. McKinsey puts the disruption from autonomous vehicles being at somewhere to 200 billion to 1.2 trillion per year. So we're talking about a lot of labor and health and everything else that's happening around that. I'd really like to know what the thought of the federal government and provocateurs and instigators like John and so on think that we should all do in the face of actually influencing a beneficial outcome versus one that is. And by the way, I'm not saying which one is beneficial. I'm just saying.
Yes. Bob, please.
Yeah, so I have a number of thoughts. So first, our Mobility on Demand program is kind of based on one question and a follow-up question. What do we do in my role? What does the government do? And do we do what? Let's start with if we do something. And some of the answer, well, one of the answers could be we get out of the way, and that's fine. But if we can do something, then what do we do? So one thing that is a kind of overarching theme is shifting from traffic management, shifting from transportation management to supporting mobility. I think to us that's a core. So again, we continue asking the questions. And so let's look at potential roles. Vince talked about a sandbox, a great opportunity to investigate some of the challenges in a research environment. So I want to evaluate that, and then I want to share it with others, because the model will not be the same in every area. So we want to share it with others. It's kind of a challenging to see how that role changes, but I want to answer that question. And so the other part, evaluate it and share it. And so we identified some of those key issues within the program, and we've engaged various teams, and Susan's on one of our teams to really help understand this and identify key issues that will support the sandbox. So we can say, please, can you help evaluate this? Why? Because you provided that to me as something you need to understand, whether it's these business models, partnerships. We look at even standards from the technical side, interoperability, when we look at data, and the requirements of data when we provide it so we can provide full accessibility, and intentionally trying to identify that somewhat different than mobility. You mentioned data management. That's a key part. I know automation, automation's in there, but is that a core? Is that an enabler, or is that something in the future element? I don't think it's a fundamental enabler. And I think something, although we look at innovative first and last mile solutions, I was very happy to see in the last panel the mention of suburban commuting, because that is still part of the land use, that is still part of the environment. Someone mentioned something yesterday. I'm that person who left college with debt. I got married later. I had children later. I moved to an environment. Perhaps I'm a terrible transportation engineer because I put myself in an environment where some of my innovative solutions are not there. But I'm very happy to see, and I'm very happy to focus and work with others, not just in the federal agencies, but learning from the local agencies. So that will allow us to answer this question. I think it's probably one of the most important questions here. We can take these innovative approaches, but how do we do it, and what is my role, and what is down the local role? And I'm looking forward to answering those questions.
All right, well, we have 5 minutes left, and we still haven't helped Bob yet. So who has questions, and who wants to help Bob? I see Sarah Kaufman there, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kaufman from the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation. You're all doing really great work with innovation in your locations or on the national level, but I think it needs to be said out loud that it's not a very diverse group up there. This is a microcosm of the higher levels of transportation leadership across the country. I would like to know what you're all doing, and Bob, you've addressed this somewhat, but to reach out to people outside of your own world, to reach out to women, non-English speakers, people who have disabilities, the elderly, people who have maybe other concerns or priorities than you do, and especially within your organizations. If we talk about disrupting mobility, we're talking about changing the way things are done. And one way to do that is to boost some people from lower or mid levels of transportation into higher leadership roles. So I'm wondering what you're doing to address that.
Well, I'm for myself. I'm sorry.
No, you have to.
I count myself as kind of diverse. I'm Hispanic. I'm from the Bronx. I think I kind of qualify in that area. And I think from a programmatic standpoint, I think we've been very interested in, and we had actually a $10 million workforce development program that we put in place to bring folks into populations that normally wouldn't be in the workforce in transit into the workforce. So women, minorities, and we worked very actively to do that. And we're trying to cue that up with this coming wave of technology and this new approach of providing service. So I think we're very mindful of that link. And kind of on the local level, it's interesting, again, because I do have the local and the federal view. It was recently, and again, I worked for DC, local planner, love DC, it's a great city. But there's been a lot of gentrification, all right? And so here you've got a part of the town called Shaw. And it was traditionally African-American for years, for decades. And all of a sudden, you've got new economic development, there's new housing going up, and there's this traditionally African-American church in the middle of it that's been there for decades. And all of a sudden, they're actually speaking to the pastor, he's saying, I can no longer live here. My people can no longer live in this neighborhood. We can't afford it anymore. Then the parking lot next to his church disappears, and curbside parking becomes too expensive for his people who are coming in now from other parts of town or from even beyond DC to come and do services at the church. And this is right, from our perspective, check the box, this is good. It's urban redevelopment, it's economic development, we're getting rid of the evil car, all of these good things, right? And then all of a sudden he gets a bike lane down the same corridor. Again, check the box, it's a good thing. He says, now we can't even, he says, we're not riding bikes. My people don't ride these bikes. So who are we governing for? Who are we providing services for? He says, so I can't live here, I can't park here, now I can't pray here. These are questions that we have to be mindful of at the local level, at the regional level, at the city level, and at the federal level. And so that's, that thinking is perhaps an answer to your diversity question.
Paul.
Just real quick, there are two things. Go to our website. I mean, we're communicating about equity and access and poverty, and we're trying, to communicate and make that issue, gain a larger audience. But two, it's really hard, and we need to do better still. It's really hard. We're actually housed with Capital Bike Share, and we work very closely with them on research and all kinds of things. But we recently announced a program called Cash for Cabbie in DC, which was to have the unbanked would be able to go to a dock or to a commuter service store and be able to pay with cash to get bike share and bike share membership. And frankly, it just has not. There haven't been many people who have signed up. So it's really hard, and it's got to be getting out into the community much more, and letting people know that it's there, and actually getting the infrastructure out there too, and the bike infrastructure as well is something that is still, it's sort of cart before the horse.
Yeah. All right, Peter, one more response, and we'll take one more question. We're almost out of time, so we'll go over here in a second. Peter, but you have a thought real fast.
I think, by the way, I agree with you. I was actually going to make a comment very specifically because it's a really non-diverse group, without making apologies to anybody up here. In LA, more than 50% of the senior leadership is now women. And at the DOT, for example, both the general manager and the chief of staff are both women. In New York City, for example, both the CIO and the CTO are both women. And in these large, diverse communities, I'm very clear that more than half of our clients, our constituents, the people who we're serving, are women. And in LA, they also come from so many different countries and backgrounds and everything else. We clearly have work to do. I'll just say that.
Great. One last question over here, please.
How you doing? My name is Robert Hampshire. I'm a professor at University of Michigan. This question is for F.T.A. and Joint Program Office. Have you guys, for your pilots and field tests, at Michigan, at Umtree, we've done the connected pilot and everything.
Sure.
Have you guys thought about the incentives to get multiple private players to cooperate in a field test? Like, what are the actual economic incentives, or have you thought about the carrots or?
Well, we're really kind of structuring the program right now. We definitely see, a role for the private sector. What we want to do is provide, and again, we're still thinking through what that program is going to look like, but I would definitely like to provide maybe planning money up front, and at least have the transit agencies speaking to the TNCs, speaking to, the full suite of partners who are going to come to the table in that sandbox, if you will. And then actually provide a second tranche of money that's going to actually give money to actually show, demonstrate a locally developed approach. I think that's probably our best bet at this point. How you structure that in a federal context is not an easy thing, I'm here to tell you. Because again, there are those controls and checks that we have to be mindful of, but at the same time, providing that flexibility, so.
Great.
All I can answer is the same answer. I mean, that is a core part of the program, is looking at the models, business models or partnerships, recognizing that it is a public-private. And so when we get in the sandbox or other ways to, again, I'm talking about risk, take on the risk for those innovative approaches.
Not to put too fine a point on it, though.
Well, yeah, no,
sorry, but I think just having us here together, the fact that he's Federal Highways and I'm Federal Transit, it was like, that's enemy territory. And that's actually a change in government and governance that is really kind of, at U.S. DOT is a big deal. So maybe it's incremental, maybe it's not enough, but it's a start.
Right. Yes, Nigel, last thought.
Sure. So I'll say in the context of local government, in terms of, because again, I don't know a ton about this program, but in terms of how we work with innovators, the incentive that we often find is data, right? These companies are coming to us, or these research groups, or whoever they are coming to us, and they need to be able to determine whether or not this thing will actually work. And so we have the same interest, because we want to know if these things will work as well, because we want to be able to explore the range of possible transportation futures as well. And so I think we meet in the middle, right, where they want to be able to grow their companies, prove their business models and so on. We want to understand how will these things fit into the tapestry of transportation options for our residents as well. And I think that there's a huge opportunity there to foster that collaboration, at those sort of intersecting interests.
Great. All right, well, thank you all so much. Round of applause for our panelists. Don't go anywhere. We're in the home stretch. Gentlemen, if you want to follow me off stage, off Laird side, and then we're going to be followed immediately. I'm going to hand off here to Ryan Chin for the design panel. We're going off, let's go off this side. They're going to come on that side. Ryan Chin.